This video demonstrates how to rib knit down the entire sock. This demonstration is done on a 66 needle cylinder with a 22 needle ribber. Here's a look at the sock we'll be making. We'll be starting the sock with E-wrap on the start of the cuff, then doing a 1x2 rib down the leg of the sock. We'll take half the needles out of work to form the heel, while keeping half of the ribber needles engaged so that we can then continue ribbing down the top of the foot of the sock. Then we'll finish by forming our toe. The toe will then be closed with the Kitchener stitch off the machine. It's important to have the machine in cylinder rotation. Because we'll eventually be ribbing, we need to be sure that the cylinder is rotating counterclockwise as viewed from above. To start the sock, we're going to E-wrap the cuff. I recently learned how to do an E-wrap by Jamie Mayfield at the Green Mountain Crank-In. She was very friendly and very knowledgeable. To begin, raise all the needles and draw the waste yarn down through the center of the cylinder. Introduce the project yarn at the start needle. The start needle is the needle marked in the green slot. I learned that when doing an E-wrap, it doesn't matter the direction in which you wrap the yarn around the needle as long as you keep this direction consistent throughout the entire process. Here is a close-up view of the motion involved in wrapping the yarn around the needle. I also learned that it's important to keep moderate tension on the yarn. Tension that is too high will strangle the needle. When doing handwork such as this, it's so great to have the revolving cylinder feature of the LT150, since it brings the work right in front of you where you can see it. So now we've gone around the entire cylinder and we're back to the start needle, ending on the needle just to the right of it. Engage the tall yarn guide for rib knitting. Once again, we'll be cranking in the comfortable direction, and we're going to start with the start needle, the needle marked in green, and we're going to lower every needle to the left of it. Here's another view of lowering the start needle and all the needles to the left of it. Continue lowering needles to the left of the start needle while positioning the cylinder so that we can feed the yarn through the tall yarn guide. The start needle is the first needle that will enter the cam track and will rise up to cast off position. Here's a view from the right side of the machine, feeding the yarn into the tall yarn guide. The E-wrapped yarn will slide off the latch and the hook will be looking for new yarn to draw a new stitch. As you advance the motion of the cylinder, you will have to manually slide the E-wrapped yarn off the latches. Viewing the stitch side of the needle motion, be sure that the latches are sliding over the E-wrapped yarn and not poking into it. On this needle, the latch did slide into the E-wrapped yarn. This condition causes a defect, but it also overloads the needle and makes it hard to crank. Lower the remaining needles, being sure that the latches remain open. Here's a view of pushing the E-wrapped yarn off the latches from the right side of the machine. Continuing back around to complete this first revolution back to the start needle. Complete a second row of plain stockinette knitting. Once the green needle comes back around to the front of the machine, engage the ribber cone. This is the 22 needle ribber cone paired with the 66 needle cylinder, which will give us a 1x2 rib. Notice how the LT150 ribber is also marked in green to indicate where it mates with the cylinder. Remove the cylinder spring and place on the green cylinder spring needle retainer holder. Begin transferring needles from the cylinder to the ribber. The first needle to be transferred from the cylinder to the ribber is the needle directly adjacent to the left of the green needle. The original Tuttle and now the Lamb LT150 use the same needle in the cylinder and the ribber. The technique shown here slides the stitch off the needle and then places it back onto the needle, eliminating the twist. Some users have told us that they don't like the look caused by twisting the stitch on the needle as they transfer the needle to and from the ribber. Here we're using a technique that eliminates that twist. Please feel free to use whichever technique you're most comfortable with. With all the ribber needles loaded, reset your counter to 0 and crank 30 rows. However, we're going to stop a little early so that we can remove half the ribber needles so that we can form our heel. When the machine settings are set properly for the yarn you're knitting, the machine runs really smooth. These machine settings are tension to the yarn, stitch length, and takedown weight. At row 28, starting with the start needle, the green needle, start removing needles from the ribber. Remove all the ribber needles between the green slot on the cylinder and the blue slot on the cylinder. This will allow us to make the heel on the front half of the cylinder. Using whichever technique you're most comfortable with, remove all the needles on the front half from the green to the blue from the ribber and transfer them into the cylinder. Okay, so we're getting to the blue. We're going to take this one out. And go like that. Put this back, and we're going to do a few rows of pre-heel. So we'll do like 5-ish. Make sure everything's open. All right, so we're going to crank 5 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the 5th. At the 5th row, switch to camshell rotation. I am going to put the cylinder out of rotation now, so I'm pushing up on the pin underneath, and I just locked it in place, so I'll do the second one. Viewing from underneath the machine, these are the pins that we're pushing up on to disengage the cylinder. Be sure to disengage the cylinder with the green slot on the right side of the machine. Here's a better view of disengaging the cylinder. While cranking, push up on the rear pin first. This will give your hand more leverage. Once the rear pin is engaged with the cylinder, then push up on the front pin. The machine is now in neutral. Notice neither the cylinder nor the camshell turns while turning the crank. With the machine in neutral, engage the camshell. Be sure to crank in the uncomfortable direction while engaging the camshell keys. Don't forget to engage the rear camshell key as well. With the camshell engaged, crank in the uncomfortable direction, stopping with the yarn guide at about 6 o'clock. Remove the yarn from the tall yarn guide and feed it into the winged yarn guide. Engage the heel spring and increase the tension on the yarn to a value of 1 or 2. This back tension is required to help the heel spring work properly. Raise all the needles in the back half of the cylinder, so every needle behind the green and blue needles need to be raised. Right? That's going to stay, whoops, these two go up, and everything up to this blue needle also goes up. Viewing the left side of the machine, the blue needle stays down. Viewing the right side of the machine, the green needle stays down as well. Since the cylinder and ribber are stationary, the ribber needles are not in action during formation of the heel. I have found that I can complete 4 passes of the heel before adding the heel weights. Do 1, 2, 3, and there's 4. Attach the V-hooks provided with your machine or whichever heel forks you prefer. Position them such that they're holding down on the knitting on the needles closest to the blue needle and closest to the green needle. Remember that your ribber is cone-shaped, so we're sneaking the V-hook or heel fork between the cone of the ribber and the ID of the cylinder. Needles, so now we can just turn around. I have 1, 2. Completing your last pass on the left side where the blue needle is, and now completing your final reduction pass on the right side where the green needle is. The final reduction pass must rotate the camshell counterclockwise, cranking in the comfortable direction. There should be 13 needles remaining in the cylinder when reduction is complete. Starting your increase, rotating the hand crank in the uncomfortable direction, lower 1 needle and wrap the yarn around behind that needle, being sure the latch remains open. As always, please use whichever heel method you're most comfortable with. This shows the last pass on the left side of the machine, wrapping the yarn behind the blue needle. Cranking your final pass in the comfortable direction, rotating the camshell counterclockwise. Lower the green needle and wrap the yarn around behind that needle. Viewing the top of the machine, our heel is complete. Notice that the yarn guide is on the right side of the machine. Now that our heel is complete, remove the yarn from the winged yarn guide and feed it back into the tall yarn guide because we're getting ready to start ribbing again. The next step is to disengage the camshell. Slowly crank in the uncomfortable direction, rotating the camshell clockwise. Align the camshell plunger with the notch on the base of the machine. Once the camshell plungers are aligned, raise both the front and the rear camshell plungers, disengaging the camshell. The machine is again in neutral. From underneath the machine, engage the cylinder to the drive gear by pulling down on the cylinder pins. Be sure to crank in the comfortable direction when engaging the cylinder. To avoid dropping a stitch on the ribber needle, be sure that the ribber needle adjacent to the green needle still has yarn that has not casted off the latch. Lower all needles, checking that the latches remain open. Viewing the right side of the machine, the cylinder is engaged and we're going to begin cranking in the comfortable direction, driving the cylinder counterclockwise. We're going to continue cranking 42 rows. These socks are for me, and that's my size. Sorry about the background noise. We were filming during noisy machine shop hours. Now that the foot of the sock is complete, transfer all the needles from the ribber back to the cylinder. With the last needle removed from the ribber cone, we can replace the needle retainer back onto the cylinder and raise the ribber cone. With the ribber removed, now is the easy part because we can see straight down through the center of the sock. As the green slot approaches the right side of the machine, disengage the cylinder. While cranking in the comfortable direction, push up on the cylinder pins. Because we're getting ready to form the toe of the sock, we need to engage the camshell. As shown earlier, push down on the camshell plungers to engage the camshell with the drive gear. Crank until the position of the yarn guide is at 6 o'clock. Remove the yarn from the tall yarn guide and pass it through the winged yarn guide. For this sock, I cranked one full row before changing to the colored yarn for the toe of the sock. Introduce the colored yarn at the green needle. Knit 2 full rows before beginning to form the toe. Raise half the needles behind the green needle and the blue needle. Proceed forming the toe of the sock, using any method that you're comfortable with. Don't forget to engage the overhead heel spring. The rest of the sock is business as usual, finishing up the toe. Here's a photo of the finished product. I hope you enjoyed watching. I tried my best to keep this one as short as possible.